So a week ago today, the US Department of Commerce listed 4 hacking companies, including the infamous NSO Group, for acting contrary to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. But these hacking companies, and I don't think I have to tell anyone here, are certainly not the only ones operating at odds with democratic principles. Now, also last week, UN experts expressed their concern about the growing use of mercenaries in cyberspace, saying that private actors provide a wide range of military and security services in cyberspace, including data collection, intelligence, and surveillance. These experts urged states not to use such services, but I don't think I have to tell you how mercenaries, as well as other private companies, can continue to contribute to malicious cyber operations. The use of private actors poses a particular challenge to accountability for abuses that occur through cyberspace, in particular across different jurisdictions, the UN experts said. Now, increasingly we see how governance and power in the hands of commercial tech firms ends up eroding democratic principles and practices. So today I want to focus on what cybersecurity means as a public responsibility, which I fear can easily get lost between detailed technological expertise, commercial tech interests, the complexity of software, and the lack of accountability mechanisms throughout the digital ecosystem. We've seen a singular focus on rapid innovation, efficiency, convenience, and that has led to an erosion of agency for public institutions and democratic norms. Now, we can all read about cybersecurity in the news almost daily. There's an avalanche of incidents, surveillance, hacks, intrusions, and thefts. And of course, for many of you, you'll think the challenge of securing data and digital infrastructure is not at all a new problem. It's just more visible today. But as technology has advanced, so have attack surfaces and the tools and methods to infiltrate, weaponize, or destroy entire digital ecosystems. And what's more is that we've seen technology, digitization, becoming a layer or part of an ever-growing set of vital sectors. Digital intruders can now surveil private citizens or extract classified information from governments, even without making headlines. The question is whether the public, as well as our democratic leaders, fully understand the consequences of this dramatic shift sufficiently. Because intrusive tools are no longer just in the hands of the NSA or GCHQ. There's a growing and so far often not illegal market of intrusion as a service. And of course, I don't mean legitimate pen testing to advance security. Instead, intelligence-trained security experts have commercialized and sort of democratized targeted surveillance in the sense that it's become much more easily available to many more people. And meanwhile, and this is a very problematic situation, democratic governments have barely acted, even as companies or militias of states have been facilitated and can now access the technologies that can be used against stated policy goals and democratic values. Think about the implications for press freedom, the right to privacy, freedom of assembly, and other universal human rights. For many people, the Pegasus project torpedoed these very harms to the top of their minds. And allowing such industries to continue unregulated and unhindered means that attacks on democratic principles and human rights are effectively condoned. Now, I personally first became concerned about European companies selling surveillance tools to authoritarian regimes during the Arab Spring a decade ago, I was serving in the European Parliament at the time and was speaking to peaceful demonstrators and activists, and they shared very painful anecdotes of being violently confronted by the police with information that they had assumed and trusted would always remain private. And what was painful was that there were European companies in the forefront of selling the tools to obtain such private data covertly, even while European governments kept urging the authoritarian leaders in Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria to by all means respect the rights of their populations. The surveillance contracts sent the opposite message. I then spent about a decade, it's hard to say it out loud, a decade tackling the surveillance economy or market and advocating for the digital rights of people everywhere. I actually miss that global perspective quite often when we consider the harms of technologies that are made in Western democracies. Now, only recently the updated EU export controls law entered into force, and frankly, it was a frustrating celebration, if I can consider it a celebration at all, given how much watered down the law is and how much the industry has grown in the meantime. And what's more is that these export controls were always going to be an imperfect solution. Because what about imports? What about accountability for the use of these systems, not only by dictators, but also by the British, the Dutch, and the French governments, other democratic governments? The lack of openness about the way in which democratic states outsource offensive capabilities hinders public accountability. And in turn, that then makes it harder for democratic states to convincingly condemn the use of NSO and other similar systems elsewhere. As such, digitization is blurring the lines between authoritarian states and democratic ones, because after all, when democratic governments are hiring the types of mercenaries we are discussing today to go after suspected criminals or terrorists, they too are fostering the same businesses, their capacities, their market share. And these companies can then use credible contracts, good references to gain ground in the very countries where the same products and services in a very different context are not used to go after criminals or terrorist suspects, but after journalists and peaceful critics of state authorities. It is more difficult to attach consequences to the very actors whose services your own police forces use. Perhaps that explains the lack of transparency. For example, the Dutch government, the country I know best, refuses to answer freedom of information requests, but it does claim not to do business with companies that also do business with shady regimes. You can call me a cynic, but when I hear such vague statements, alarm bells go off. Mechanisms of checks, balances, independent oversight, and accountability exist for a reason. But when we look at those principles in light of the use of technology companies today, such countervailing powers are too often missing. The ad hoc statement by the US Department of Commerce ends up only scratching the surface. And that brings me to the key point of my talk today. Why democratic principles must guide how we govern and secure our digital infrastructure. I'll share some more examples of why it's problematic that countries now overdepend on private companies to protect, but often also build, their digital infrastructure. I'll close with an outline with some solutions, and then I really look forward to interaction with you, your feedback, and your questions. Now, the intrusion technologies that NSO Group makes and other companies make may be the most colorful and even extreme example of the power of tech companies to go against principles of democratic states. But at the same time, we have to look at the other side of the equation. Governments themselves are evading accountability by outsourcing important tasks to tech companies. Let me offer an example. When a government wants to send men and women from the men and women to the battlefield, it usually needs permission from the elected representatives of the people, the parliament. Such a mandate actually ensures that there is support for using the ultimate remedy, that of the use of force. But have you ever heard a defense minister asking for permission to launch a phishing attack or to take out a state-sponsored troll army? Now, some of you may argue, well, of course not, because that would defeat the purpose. These missions are covert to avoid detection and tip off targets. But that is actually true in a ground and air war too. While the mandate is given democratically, the tactical decisions are still discreetly taken. But, and this is crucial, commanders of the armed forces, defense, and other ministers know that there is both a mandate and accountability when their mission is over. Civilian casualties, loss of troops, wrongly bombarded targets, they all have consequences, or should have consequences. For instance, the late Colin Powell resigned due to his missteps in the US 2003 invasion of Iraq. And the year before that, the entire Dutch government stepped down to take responsibility for mistakes that it made in its role around the fall of Srebrenica in the war in former Yugoslavia. And only 2 months ago, the foreign minister of the Netherlands resigned over the failed withdrawal and failure to expatriate supporting interpreters to the mission in Afghanistan. These democratic leaders could not avoid accountability. And the democratic process worked. They had to accept the political and democratic consequences of their actions. I think it's important to be reminded from time to time that even in times of the worst conflicts, in war, laws, norms, checks, and balances apply. But many of these crucial parameters are lost, they're vague and ambiguous, or ignored when we look at what's happening in the digital realm. And that is fundamental, because the type of accountability that I'm pointing to actually sets democracies apart from regimes where the powers that be literally get away with murder, not only abroad, but often at home as well. And more broadly, as societies are becoming more reliant on digital technology, questions of responsibility, liability, and accountability are unclear. They're not filled in. Democratic processes offer less transparency over privately run software used in key places compared to what we're accustomed to and may expect in the analog world. And in fact, President Biden recently noted this too. He made what I thought was a very revealing acknowledgement a few months ago after he hosted a cybersecurity summit at the White House. He said, most of our critical infrastructure is now owned and operated by the private sector, and the federal government can't meet this challenge alone. And he is correct. The dramatic reality is that most critical infrastructure is now in the hands of private companies. It's created, operated, protected by private companies. And I think that's a problem, not for the companies, but for the democratic balance of power. So, how do we get to this point? Over the past couple of decades, digital technology and software has spread to almost every part of our lives and economies. It's in personal devices, cars, factories, universities, agriculture, business, government. And that change, of course, has brought a lot of progress. Let's not forget. New tools, better service, more productivity, more efficiency. But I don't think I have to remind anyone here today that software has a dark side. 0 days are hidden across every piece of software that is used, and I have yet to hear confidence from a security researcher that the amount of 0 days that keeps growing is manageable at all. Each time we've integrated software into yet another aspect of companies, governments, or personal lives, we end up expanding the attack surface for malevolent hackers a bit more. And the discovery and exploitation of 0 days is now so common that it's become almost a cliche for engineers and executives to say that software will simply never be hack-proof. Even the best functioning responsible disclosure programs have not tilted that scale. And I think we should really let that sink in for a moment. And I would love to hear your thoughts after I finish. Is this an acceptance of defeat? For me, simply acknowledging that software can never be secure is a very unsatisfying answer. I do think there are many ways in which we can hold those firms that build technologies and software to account in a more efficient way. And we have to make sure that there is a proportionate response to the fact that billions of people use these products everywhere around the world and that risks need to be mitigated. Throwing our hands up and giving up, I don't think is good enough, especially as sales and use continue. At the very least, the price for criminals as well as for hostile states must go up to end the impunity, and the effort on the part of billion-dollar companies should be much more serious. My challenge for everyone here today is straightforward, although I know there are no simple answers. How can we build systems that are secure and rights-respecting from the beginning? If we don't find a solution, we may face an ever darker future that Edward Snowden recently described as a world of people too busy playing with their phones to even notice that someone else controls them. Now, one ingredient of any solution is that the public needs to be able to understand the impact of technologies used throughout society. But that too is easier said than done. Access to information, but also knowledge of them and of their workings is often lacking. National or local governments have little way of looking in detail at how the software that powers hospitals or electricity networks actually operates, or to independently assess the risks of intrusions and attacks on their networks. Trade secret protections, intellectual property often gets in the way. That legislatures and city councils aren't aware of what security testing those systems are subject to, and that national security agencies are forced to rely on commercial systems and data to accomplish their goals. Anything from building infrastructure to operating, securing, assessing for risk, and defending it are in the hands of a web of different companies. And apparently so far, given the uptake and the increase in digitization, the trust that these companies will do a good job almost seems blind and endless. Now, of course, systems are tested all the time by attackers, both white hat and black hat. Large cyber attacks like WannaCry or SolarWinds end up dominating the headlines, but most intrusions don't come as one large blow that's easy for journalists to cover. Instead, cyber attacks tend to be a series of steady punches, and when they're most successful, we may never hear about them. So instead of fixating on those few highly visible and easily explainable attacks, we need to take a comprehensive look at how democratic institutions can modify private sector incentives and take a larger role in building robust protections with processes that fit within the rule of law. It is, of course, also crucial to attach far greater consequences for the perpetrators. But today, and Jeff hinted at it in his introduction as well, laws and regulations don't give the right incentives. Take the ransomware attack last May on Colonial Pipeline. Hackers were able to take control of Colonial systems through an employee's VPN logging credential, which didn't use multi-factor authentication. Now, of course, becoming the victim of a cyber attack is a terrible problem for any company. Employees at Colonial, like at most other companies, hospitals, universities, or local governments, are not experts in digital security and may panic when they're faced with a ransomware attack. They may feel forced to pay the ransom to avoid negatively impacting their own customers, even though on the whole, paying up perpetuates the ransomware model for criminals. And following the Colonial attack, the FBI, now wait for it, assisted the company in paying $4.4 million in ransom. And not only the software vendors avoid being held liable for the crisis in attacks caused, but the public may never fully know what actually happened and how the attack could take place. I thought it was even more absurd when I learned that Colonial's ransom payment will likely also be tax deductible for the company. So if you're looking at how incentives are upside down, this is a pretty good case study. Now, again, on the other side of the equation, we have to acknowledge how lawmakers in democratic societies have not nearly done enough to mandate protections. In the United States, the approach has been a state-by-state patchwork. And in the EU, some policies have gone further, but they have not placed sufficiently targeted regulations and solutions on protecting public values by placing limits on the privatization of nearly everything digital across the board. And then there's a lack of global collaboration. Liberal states have left a regulatory vacuum, which has created fertile ground for both the attackers and non-democratic states. Authoritarian states have taken enormous advantage of a vacuum and have asserted themselves. New technologies for them are just another tool in the arsenal of growing state power and influence. Authoritarian governments have hired private spyware companies to surveil their own citizens or to silence dissidents. And as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, and I think almost inexplicably, private firms in democracies have been more than willing to make these sales to authoritarian regimes. And the end result of all of this, privatization, increasing outsourcing, a lack of regulation, is that everyday people, ordinary citizens, are often very far from focus when we think about cybersecurity missions, even though it might be their data that is the first casualty of many breaches. When Equifax settled with the FTC following the massive leak of personal information of 147 million people, they agreed to pay $575 million, which is less than $4 for each person they placed in danger. Sure, putting people at the center of cybersecurity will be hard, but I believe it is crucial. So I will offer a couple of steps that I hope are realistic, but still able to make a big difference. First, we need stronger transparency requirements. Today, we only know which private companies are selling what surveillance or hacking tools to which governments because of courageous whistleblowers or effective journalists. There is so much information that is missing. Not only products procured, but also attacks discovered. To make that type of information available to the public, government should institute transparency and auditing requirements. And similarly, there need to be better standards for information sharing between companies, intelligence services, and governments to strengthen public knowledge and incident response. Second, it is time to ban the most harmful systems. Yes, transparency requirements are important, but just knowing which tools are used by your neighborhood police, or rather that are being sold to authoritarian regimes, won't stop the market. Democratic governments must prevent firms from selling invasive and harmful tools to the highest bidder when they're often their opponents. Tools like Pegasus, in my opinion, have no legitimate use, or if they are used legitimately, the harms elsewhere are just disproportionate. And they certainly should not be easily accessible for human rights abusers. I'm going to quote Edward Snowden again. when he pointed out that there is no market for bioweapons, and there shouldn't be a market for cyber weapons either. Thirdly, we need to create better incentives to build safer products. As I mentioned, and I think Jeff pointed out in his introduction too, the structure for cybersecurity as an incentive structure is backwards. Criminals can attack systems because they make money and don't pay the price. Software companies are often not incentivized to build better software because they don't pay the cost of breaches either. Society does. The public purse does. And individuals end up stuck in the middle, powerless. That must change. There should be better, clear requirements of how to build safer systems and liability consequences when there's negligence. Fourthly, there should be update requirements. The public sector, hospitals, universities, and schools are often very much behind in terms of keeping their operating systems and software up to date. It can be expensive. But even preventing tactics such as two-factor authentication are often overlooked. Recall the colonial pipeline hack. And so there are simply too many opportunities to be exploited. And we have to help public organizations and organizations with great exposure to actually make the right decisions, to be equipped to do so. Imagine if you are leading a hospital. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And with your limited budget, you have to choose between hiring another intensive care nurse or updating proprietary software. It may actually be a pretty easy decision to postpone the IT update. From a patient care perspective, it's a perfectly legitimate choice, but it's a very challenging consequence for cybersecurity. This is where governments can help. They can ensure minimum safeguards against attacks by developing requirements for companies to update outdated systems when these pose a national security risk. Another approach could be a targeted tax on tech companies to help fund publicly available security solutions. Fifth, procurement, so the public purse, is an enormous lever. When we compare requirements in the banking sector and financial services, they must adhere to strict standards and assess the completeness, efficacy, and security of products before buying and using them. The same goes for all kinds of software used in the financial services industry. That is necessary because software would act as a proxy of these industries or part of these industries, and these sectors, financial services and banking, are heavily regulated. So there is just no scenario in which software used by banks could actually undermine those responsibilities. But too often in other sectors where requirements and accounting standards are not as clear, we see that vendors may sell untested blueprints or hyped versions of their products, and that leaves the unaware customer too vulnerable for potential misuse. It is important that private and public sector clients adopt stricter standards to ensure that they are purchasing high-quality systems. And I think this is where, for example, national governments can help local ones, can help public institutions by offering model contracts and guidelines to help empower them in the process of procurement. Sixth, the public sector lacks the crucial tech talent to support them. I teach at Stanford, and I often hear my students weighing their career ambitions. They end up seeking jobs at big tech firms rather than, for example, the US government. Now, of course, what is driving these decisions is often high student debt, unfortunately, but also opportunities that are just much greater when we think about research, access to data, compute, and other facilities that just don't compare between the private sector and the public sector. So we need specialized programs by governments and universities to help support and emphasize the importance of public interest technology and to offer incentives that are aimed at specialized training to attract the nation's top talents. It's important that our brightest minds see the public sector as an opportunity, not just as a fallback. And then lastly, democracies need to collaborate. Unfortunately, we do not see enough action, clarity, international agreements coming from international organizations, and they can really only act when there's political leadership by member countries. And given the very cross-border international nature of both cybercrime, cyber conflict, but also trade and relations between people, it is important that democratic countries take the lead and produce a framework. They can forge a coalition to strengthen international law, to reinterpret international law, and to create new rules and guidelines for independent oversight. Such partnerships are essential in everything from punishing elusive hackers to successfully banning the sales of hacking technologies to authoritarian regimes. Tribunals, accountability, or attribution mechanisms may all be the result of such democratic coalitions seeking to protect age-old core principles in ever-changing new digital contexts. And finally, a last point for you, people here at Black Hat. I believe that your voices and skills are crucial to inform the debate about what the problem really is and what solutions we need. Few people know more about the details, about what is required to build good, and by good I mean good for the public, digital defenses than everyone sitting in this room. No one has more insider knowledge and expertise to shift the focus towards that public interest. Your voices and skills really matter. So I would love to hear what opportunities you see to help disengage from contracts with anti-democratic actors, or how you may build and push for stronger investments in proactive security. It might be good to see how you can engage with public officials and politicians to explain what the levers and important ways are to make sure that there is more robust cyber security. Or you may want to alert me to parts of the work that you do and that people like me need to understand better. I worry that every time we read about another cyber attack, hack, or leak, there's not just the immediate harm and impact for the victims, but there's a secondary blow. People lose trust when they never hear of a perpetrator being caught or an attacker paying the price. As of now, I think malevolent attackers have a step ahead of us. And if democratic governments do not do more to lead by example in their own behavior or to hold tech companies to account and liable for cyber intrusions, I fear that the problems will get worse. Global democracies, and each and every one of us is a citizen in that democracy, so can really play their part. Democracies must ensure that cybersecurity is focused on protecting people and their democratic rights. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have time for questions, and there are 2 mics. I know it's a little dark in here, but they're spotlighted in the back of the rows between the seats. So if there's anyone who has had enough caffeine to ask a question or to share a comment, I would love that.
Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. On the PC Security channel, I often get questions from companies about how to protect themselves from ransomware. But then when we actually look at their defenses, a lot of their policy is disconnected from reality. So for example, as someone who analyzes ransomware every day, I know that ransomware can have impact in the course of a few minutes. When some of these policies, you have a tier 1 analyst, a tier 2 analyst, and then the decision maker. And often it's like, even if they do find a ransomware, they're going to react in maybe a couple of days, which is just not realistic. So how do we get better information to the decision makers and policy makers so that policy is actually informed by the technology and not the other way around? Because the reality is, it doesn't matter what the policy is. The code is going to execute on the system the way it does. And we need to have that kind of information with the decision makers so we have smarter policy overall. So how do you think we can do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think there are easy solutions here, but it strikes me that there is currently not only a lack of trust, oftentimes between different actors. So, for example, any organization that may have been impacted by a ransomware attack, or the company that sits in between and that has been the, unfortunate vehicle for the attack. So I don't think there are clear mechanisms. I mean, I don't think it's even clear for, let's say, your average hospital to know who they should call when this situation occurs. And so what I've seen happen over and over again in crisis is that when people are shocked, they shut down and they start to go into damage control mode, not just damage control of the systems, but also of their reputation, of their information. And it may lead, which I think we see too often, to a calculation that paying the ransom is the road of least resistance. And then we've also had a lot of cases where actually the ransom has been paid, the incident has occurred, and the information is never shared. We cannot learn whether we're in a company, whether we're in a public organization, whether we're in the government. There's just no avenue of understanding better how to avoid this in the future. And so I think a crucial element of building that trust is to start working on better avenues of sharing information, both when the incidents happen, obviously also trying to prevent, right? Have sort of guidelines of how to handle when your systems are hacked, and to gradually get to a better place. And, it's probably going to be difficult, right, to have a perfect solution. And as you said, speed is of the essence. But the incentives that I mentioned, when a company or an organization is better off fiscally when they pay the ransom, I think those are just, not helping, so to say. If I'm imagining myself as a criminal, trying to think, what are my options, then I think their business model explains why we still have so many ransomware attacks and why it's really like a pandemic of its own.
So do you think it's just about the incentive structure rather than people not having the right information?
No, it's actually about, I hope that was clear, about sharing the information and also about building trust in doing so. I think there's both not sort of muscle right now. I don't think there are good practices. I don't think there are predictable paths. I don't think it's clear for many people who should be sharing information when and why. So I think building trust through information sharing is crucial. To get away from the idea that maybe the victim was to blame and made mistakes and it's silly, or they could have done a better job to prevent this. To really actually make sure that there is available expertise. I think state organizations can also really play a role here, and that there should be more support for those public institutions that are now clearly targeted, but that just lack resources, meaning money, knowledge, expertise to actually properly be able to act in the line of fire where they are. So I think it's a matter of setting up better processes, information sharing, faster communications, which can hopefully lead to trust and simply better resilience and crisis response.
Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. Philippe from CrowdSec. I wanted to ask, you wouldn't allow someone to drive on the street without a driver license. And if they do damages to your family or anyone, they're actually responsible for that. But what we see online in the cyberspace is like people are using the tool without knowing what they're doing. And basically 80% or more of the breaches that are happening is because people are not following the basic cybersecurity principles. So where should we draw a line and say, those people are responsible at some point? Because they deployed something, architecture, infrastructure, stored data, and they didn't do the proper job at securing it. So being in the posture of saying like, they're not responsible because they've been hacked and victim of criminals and stuff, it's not playing out nicely. We should at some point, I guess, have some minimum level that it should be accountable for. No? Thoughts?
Thank you. Sorry, but I didn't hear everything as clearly as I had hoped. I think it's an acoustics problem in the room a little bit.
Maybe the mask.
Maybe.
Or my English, most likely.
No. So, are you talking about the minimum standards for companies or accountability standards for perpetrators, or both?
No, actually, for the companies, sorry, it would be better like this. Like, you know, they are operating tools, but most of them are not having the very basic security in place. Like, and even if you talk about those large venues, like, you know, for example, this SolarWind or Colonial and stuff, it's not like high-level, high-profile hacks. Actually, you know, they brute force password or they found their way in a VPN. Come on, that's not like rocket science. Not like if those people did a good job in the first place. So where do we draw a line in the sand between like, you should have done that and you're accountable, or okay, I mean, that's too much of a complicated attack and, you know, anyone would have fallen for that.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So I worry that there may be over-trust in software vendors or overselling by software vendors. You know, how come systems are sold without proper login protections? You know, who should train the staff? And I think here it's both about spelling out those chains of responsibility and attaching consequences. Because as far as I was able to discern from sort of post-mortem analysis, there had been warnings by security experts at SolarWinds, somebody who left because they felt like their concerns were not really taken up. And I think it's especially concerning if it's not rocket science. You know, that should really concern us. I can understand that it's difficult, and apparently it is, you know, for major companies like Microsoft to fend off state attackers, right? But when it's not a state attacker, or when it's, like you said, a brute force or, you know, sort of password level compromise, then you really have to ask yourself, you know, why are these low-hanging fruits not picked? And I think it's a product, frankly, of over-relying on the fact that companies will provide solid products. And either by having better guidelines of what a solid product looks like and having more liability mechanisms to make sure that if a company is negligent, because frankly, for all of you, if there's one software company that really messes up badly, people will think that all of the software companies are terrible, or that it's just, you know, a big problem. So I think better standards, both in industry and mandated by policy, can be helpful here. And that in turn can really just drive up the standards and filter out those who are unwilling or unable to make those investments despite significant profits.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I was curious, in the context of democracies and offensive cyber capabilities, if you were trying to advise like the head of a liberal democracy who wanted to intercept communications to, say, some authoritarian heads of state Android device, how would they do that legitimately, or is it impossible to get a legitimate democratic mandate for that kind of action?
Thanks for the question. So at the moment, and this is also curious, I didn't mention it in my introduction, but it's definitely something that, you know, deserves more discussion. Intrusion for the purpose of espionage is often not considered illegal. And the question now becomes, which means to facilitate espionage, state-to-state espionage, are proportionate, or when does, you know, if there's intrusion on the systems level with huge, you know, spread of risk, for example, Exchange server hack, when does that cross the line? You know, when can you say, okay, fine, you may have the aim of conducting espionage, but the means used are just so disproportionate that we are going to interpret it also as, you know, an attack of a different caliber. The problem is that laws throughout all the areas that we're talking about today and that you're pointing to are not clear. And attackers know this. So they're exploiting the ambiguity. They're exploiting the fact that there's probably not going to be a price. The issue that I talked about is in terms of democratic mandates and accountability, is more about engaging in conflict. So I understand, and I'm not completely naive. I don't think that intelligence services are going to ask for a mandate to spy. You know, I mean, it would be a great world, but, you know. However, if you look at the use of force, you know, by state authorities, either hired through companies or self-engaged, these are very serious steps. And I understand that practically speaking, defense in the digital realm may require offense. But if you do so without a mandate and everything is a stealth retaliation for another stealth attack, then there is no threshold anymore. There is no accountability. There is no oversight. And I simply think that that is unacceptable if you are claiming to do so in the name of defending an open society. And so I do think there have to be clear mandates and chains of accountability as well, where we don't end up in a situation where there's tit for tat that just spirals out of control and no one is responsible formally. So I would make a distinction between what is required and realistic around espionage, even though I think there's a need to clarify proportionality, and the notion of engaging in acts of war, you know, offensive as an aspect of defensive capabilities, which those lines are all very much blurred in the digital realm in a way that the laws have not yet been updated to. And I think that that is what is needed.
Awesome. Thank you for the answer. That's great.
Thank you. I think we may have time for one quick question.
Okay, hi, I'm Fred. I'd like to ask, since you suggest a ban on surveillance tools like Pegasus, wouldn't this drive this more into the black market and therefore making it even harder to control it or to even know who is using this kind of technology than it is today? And yeah, how would this improve the situation?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And I've thought about this a lot. When I was working on the export controls regime that the EU currently has. So obviously, if you ban a product in a certain jurisdiction, let's imagine for now the European Union, then a number of these companies will move. They may go to the United Arab Emirates, or they may go to Asia, who knows where they might go, outside of that jurisdiction. But it does begin to raise the bar. And I do believe you have to start somewhere. If you want to avoid the proliferation of these tools, which is really actually hurting liberal democracies, if you want to have the ability to, at one point, protect yourself when you are no longer a leading market and when those tools are being used massively inside your society, you need some kind of law or norm to protect yourself. So I think it has to start somewhere, ideally in as large as possible an area. While it is imperfect, it would at least set liberal democratic societies apart in what they think is acceptable use of these types of systems from those societies that do not even pretend that those are principles they care about. And I think it often happens like that. I mean, there are countries in the world that respect universal human rights. There are those that don't. There are countries that have the death penalty. There are countries that don't. And it always has to start somewhere if you want to try to raise the bar. And I think we've reached that point now, not only because it is principally a very harmful market for democratic societies, but also security-wise. The proliferation of these tools is assisting opponents of liberal democracy. And so if you want to work on cyber stability, I think one logical step would be to turn off the tab of the providers of instability. I think my time is up. I see a big flashing clock over here. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful Black Hat conference.